In this talk, we will be discussing the link between prosodic prominence and information structure in speech acts that require high prosodic prominence, verb-first exclamatives in German. Exclamatives are a type of speech act and are used to express surprise and/or amazement at a state of affairs. In German, there are two kinds of exclamative, WH exclamatives and verb-first exclamatives. Both kinds are string identical to questions, either WH questions or polar questions. In this talk, we will be discussing verb-first exclamatives, such as the example given in 1, which is pronounced, for example, something like hat der leckere Kekse gebacken. Note the D pronoun in subject position. D pronouns are string identical to definite articles, and they are quite common in colloquial spoken language. They occur often in exclamatives but can also occur in other speech acts. And also note that absent of any context, the differentiation between exclamatives and questions falls on prosody. First off, let me give you the definitions of the information structural concepts that we use. By given information, we mean referents which are lexically given in the context. In assertions, given information tends to be de-accented, and if accented, to carry less prominent accents, and to also be of shorter duration. New information refers to referents that have not been previously mentioned and that do not have explicit alternatives in the utterance context, something like the default case. New information is less likely to be de-accented and more likely to carry more prominent accents, both in comparison with given information. Finally, contrastive focus refers to terms for which the previous context provides an explicit alternative. Contrastive focus tends to manifest in very prominent accents, such as L plus H star, in very long durations and in high pitch maxima. Note that our materials do not include explicit corrections or rejections, which also express a type of contrast, but this is not the type of contrastive focus that we looked at. Previous work on exclamatives in German suggests that exclamatives, when compared to assertions, are inert when it comes to the marking of given information. For example, Jacobs 1988 claims that the location of the so-called exclamative accent is independent of focus marking. Furthermore, Rep 2019 found given objects to be reliably accented in exclamatives, and we found in a series of experiments that are reported in an upcoming article that subject D pronouns, such as der in example number 1, are quite frequently accented even though they are always given. In what follows, the notion of constructional defaults will become relevant. These go back to Neitsch and Niebuhr 2019, who proposed so-called prosodic constructions, which are bundles of continuous and categorical features that are used to mark certain speech acts. Based on previous findings, Repp and Seliger propose a constructional default for German exclamatives. German exclamatives are characterized by an increase of prosodic prominence on a lexically given element, usually a D pronoun, which itself is more likely to appear in exclamatives than in assertions. Some speakers, however, tend to place a prominent accent on the finite auxiliary verb instead of the D pronoun, which is to say on hat in example number 3. Neither of the two accents leads to pragmatic or semantic effects, so these accents appear to be in free variation. And finally, exclamatives also exhibit a slower speaking rate when compared to questions. We have the following research questions. First, can we replicate the previous finding that in exclamatives, given information is not marked by de-accentuation or otherwise? This previous finding was based on German WH exclamatives, and we want to know whether that extends to German verb first exclamatives. The second research question is, how does the marking of contrastive focus interact with the proposed constructional default? So the question is, do speakers still accent the D pronoun, or do they shift stress to the contrastive element? Here's a look at an example item in all three conditions. The target sentence at the bottom is identical across conditions. What's different is the preceding context. And the differences are here shown in curly brackets. So I'm going to read one condition, the new condition. We have a dialogue between two speakers, speaker A and speaker B, and speaker A says, "Last night there was a proper food orgy at Maria's sea party. Unbelievable the amount of seafood that people devoured." And then speaker B goes on to say, "Indeed, Fritz, for instance, hat der viele Hummer verschlungen. Boy, did he ever devour many lobsters." So in the new condition, we have a hypernym. So lobsters are a type of seafood. In the given condition, shown in blue, we just have a repetition of the word lobsters. And in the contrast condition, shown in green, we have crabs. So something that is another type of seafood, something that is a focus alternative to hummer, which is to say lobsters. And our participants heard the part of speaker A and spoke the part of speaker B. We had 27 participants, all of whom were female. We had a total of 9 items in 3 conditions, which resulted in a total of 699 recordings after exclusion of errors. The statistical analysis is done using linear mixed models, and generalized linear mixed models were applicable. And the reference level for the statistics will always be new objects. So we will always compare contrastive to new objects and given objects to new objects. Here are the results for the choice of accent placement. If a bar on this plot reaches 100%, it would mean that an accent was placed on the corresponding syllable in 100% of productions. What we see here is that D pronouns are accented significantly less often in the contrastive condition, again shown in green, and we find that contrastive objects are accented more often than new objects. So in terms of accent placement, we see that there is no de-accentuation of given objects relative to new objects. Here are the results for accent types. This time the 3 conditions are split across the 3 facets, and we can see that contrastive objects are more likely to carry L plus H star accents, which are more prominent than H star accent. And L plus H star accents are here represented by the black bars. Given objects carry L plus H star accents less often. So there is a decrease here in between these 2 black bars. And we see that for D pronouns, there is roughly a 50% split between H star and L plus H star, regardless of condition. No significant differences here. This graph shows the result for the pitch measures on accented D pronouns on the left and accented objects on the right, both split up by accent type, so H star versus L plus H star. Only syllables bearing L plus H star accents showed significant differences. Contrastive objects with L plus H star accent showed greater pitch range than new objects and higher maximum pitch. On the other hand, accented D pronouns with L plus H star accent showed lower maximum F0. And finally, contrastive objects with L plus H star accent showed lower minimum F0. In terms of duration and intensity of accented D pronouns and objects, contrastive objects with L plus H star accents were longer than new objects, and accented D pronouns with H star accents were shorter in utterances with contrastive objects than in utterances with new objects. Taking a look at the utterance level, we find that utterances with contrastive objects showed greater F0 range, greater intensity range, and lower mean F0. Mean intensity did not show significant differences. So, we have the following answers to our research questions. Is there a lack of givenness marking in German verb first exclamatives? Yes, to the extent that both the subject D pronoun and the given objects showed little givenness marking. In fact, the only difference was that L plus H star accents were less common on given than on new objects. Secondly, contrastive focus and the proposed constructional default interact in such a way that there is an increase of prosodic prominence on the contrastive focus expression itself and a decrease of prosodic prominence on the D pronoun that is accented per constructional default. That is, the default is disturbed to some extent. We propose that givenness marking may have a different function in exclamatives than in assertions. Since exclamatives presuppose their entire content, that content is given anyway, which might render additional prosodic givenness marking redundant and thus less likely to appear. An alternative explanation is that previous work on givenness marking tended to use monological data, while we used dialogues. It is possible that there is a larger increase of givenness within speaker terms than across speaker terms. However, it must be noted that Klassen and Wagner 2017 did find de-accentuation across speaker terms in assertions. So we know that a previous mention by another speaker does trigger givenness marking in assertions. In our experiments, it didn't. As for contrastive focus, we found an increase of prosodic prominence on the contrastive focus expression itself in terms of the number of accents, in terms of accent types, and in terms of phonetic parameters. We also found a decrease in prominence on another element, which was usually the D pronoun. Here, the decrease was in terms of the number of accents and in terms of phonetic parameters. Objects that are the site of contrastive focus must be highly prominent, and a reduction of default prominence on another element further helps increase the prominence of contrastive focus. What does all of this tell us about the proposed constructional default for German exclamatives? We propose that exclamatives require at least one prosodically highly prominent element. If an element attracts prosodic prominence for independent reasons, such as contrastive focus, for example, this element can also serve to mark the speech act-related prosodic prominence. If there is no such element, such as when the whole sentence is given, the constructional default applies and we get the exclamative accent, usually on the D pronoun, sometimes for a minority of speakers on a finite auxiliary. I want to thank you for your attention, and we are happy to take questions and comments.